Hello, everyone! You are listening to Through Time and Clades. My name is Joan.
And I'm Albert.
This episode comes as a bit of a surprise, even to us. We were all set to, finish off the year with our last few episodes when we received the immense honor of being invited by Edge to participate in Paleo Rewind 2021. Paleo Rewind is a big collaboration among paleo YouTubers to recap the past year in paleontological discoveries, and for our segment, we will be covering studies that came out during the second half of July. Now, for news from the first half of July, check out the Paleo Rewind video on our friend Zeke's channel, Raptor Chatter, which will be linked in the description below alongside all the other Paleo Rewind entries this year. Without further ado, let's jump in.
All right. So, first up is actually the only story we picked describing a new dinosaur, or a new species of any sort, in fact. I talked about this find in more detail in the 2021 update special for our series, Dinosaurs, the Second Chapter, but in brief, it is a new genus and species of fossil bird from the Eocene of England called Archaeodromus anglicus. Archaeodromus was a member of a group of extinct birds called archaeotrogonids, and when they were first described in the 19th century, archaeotrogonids were considered to be closely related to a group of modern tropical birds called the trogons, hence their name. However, more complete specimens later showed that they're more likely members of a completely different group, Strysaures, which includes nightjars, potoos, frogmouths, swifts, hummingbirds, and some of their other close relatives. This is one of my favorite groups of birds, and their evolution is one of the main subjects of my PhD thesis. So, if you'd like to hear more about their diversity and evolution, you should check out episode 5 of Dinosaurs, the Second Chapter, which is available on our channel. Something strange about the fossil record of Strysaures is that until recently, we didn't have good fossil evidence of early members of the nightjar lineage. We had pretty good Paleogene fossils of early potoos, early frogmouths, early swifts, and even early hummingbirds, but not nightjars, which is very odd because modern nightjars, of which I have a modern species pictured here, they're quite diverse, with nearly 100 species, and they're found all over the world. But this new bird, Archaeodromus, which is known from partial skeleton, including some vertebrae, wing bones, and parts of the skull, it exhibits features that not only support the idea that archaeotrogonids are members of Strysaures, but also that archaeotrogonids might belong specifically to the nightjar lineage. And if this is correct, then it turns out that the real stem nightjars were with us all along. And so the archaeotrogonids can help us fill in this noticeable gap in the avian fossil record. And interestingly, some archaeotrogonids, including apparently undescribed specimens of Archaeodromus, had these bony spikes on their wrists that they might have used for fighting each other, which is not something we see in living members of Strysaures.
Excellent. So, next up, we have a paper regarding the Radiodonts, which were one of the largest groups of stem arthropods that first gained a foothold in the seas of the Cambrian period. If you know genera like Anomalocaris or the recently described Agirocassis, those were members of this clade. A notable feature of these animals were their frontal appendages, these large segmented structures that were tipped with rows of spines, which were hypothesized to have been like grasping arms, allowing a radiodont to grab a passing trilobite or jellyfish and transfer them to their crushing mouthparts, as illustrated to the right. While this has been a popular image for some time, there has never really been any good understanding of just how these frontal appendages moved and worked. That's where this paper came in. The authors making digital models of the arms of 5 different radiodont species from the Burgess Shale site to reconstruct their ranges of motion. As was hypothesized from previous studies, there was found to be a significant diversity in the ways that different radiodont species use their frontal appendages. Some examples include Anomalocaris, which was found to have quite flexible arms for hunting mostly soft-bodied prey animals like the potentially deuterostome betulacolians. The squatter-bodied Peytoia was found to have a more jaw-like appendages for nipping and handling larger and more hard-bodied animals. And then there's Cambrobraster, which was originally hypothesized to have been a sediment sifter, but was actually found to have perhaps been a filter-feeding radiodont, as the long spines on their appendages were more suited to that task. Now, one curious aspect of this study was that in all cases, radiodonts were found to have been quite inefficient feeders compared to true arthropods. Despite the flexible frontal appendages, their use alongside poorly specialized oral cones meant that food could not be easily processed and digested. This likely explains why most of the group died out following the Cambrian period, their niches being replaced by more efficient predatory invertebrates. But we do have at least some suspension feeding species that seem to have survived into the Devonian period.
Cool.
All right, and our next story concerns a member of the robust Australopithecines, Paranthropus robustus, who has historically been nicknamed the Nutcracker Man because the initial analyses of their heavy skulls, jaws, and teeth pointed to a diet of mostly hard foods like nuts and seeds. This idea has gradually been worn away through subsequent studies, which instead pointed to these hominins as grazers of grasses and other C4 plants. For one thing, a close look at the microwear on the teeth did not show evidence of hard food consumption, and carbon isotope studies pointed closer to plants like grasses than anything else. The large teeth and prominent sagittal crest on the skull were there to support the sorts of strong muscles needed to process tough grasses, much like that of living gorillas. This particular study effectively added yet another nail to the coffin of the Nutcracker Man moniker. Here, the authors examined tooth chipping patterns on the teeth of Paranthropus robustus, as well as several other hominins and non human primates, to see whether there was any evidence there regarding potential diets. Indeed, Paranthropus showed more similarities with species like chimpanzees and colobus monkeys, in that they had far less tooth chipping present than other primates that tended to eat more solid foods, like mandrills or sake monkeys. This is expected if Paranthropus robustus was mostly eating grasses and fruits, which don't leave chip marks on teeth. It seems ever more likely that this species of hominin was not a living nutcracker, and we now have multiple lines of evidence to support this.
It's always good to see kind of corroborating evidence for established ideas. And our next story kind of does something similar, though for a very different group of animals. These are the ever fascinating pterosaurs, those Mesozoic flying reptiles that were probably closely related to dinosaurs but were not dinosaurs themselves. Some researchers have long suspected that juvenile pterosaurs were probably capable of flight, maybe even as soon as they hatched, but a new study tests this idea in detail. So the authors looked at juvenile specimens of Pterodustro from the early Cretaceous of South America and Sinopterus from the early Cretaceous of China. And one of these juvenile Sinopterus was actually a specimen formerly considered a distinct genus, Nemicolopterus. In any case, what the authors found was that the size of the wings in juvenile pterosaurs would have allowed them to glide extremely effectively, covering much longer distances than modern gliding animals such as flying squirrels can. Now, gliding animals are adapted to cover moderate distances through the air while not spending excessive resources. So, if juvenile pterosaurs could glide much farther than specialized gliders, then this suggests that they were regularly traveling greater distances through the air, consistent with being capable of powered flight. The authors also found that the strength of the wing bones in juvenile pterosaurs was probably more than enough to sustain stresses necessary for launching into flight, and in fact would be hard to explain as serving any other function besides flight. If pterosaurs were able to fly as juveniles, this probably implies that they were able to take care of themselves from a young age, at least when it comes to moving around and feeding. Because juvenile pterosaurs were often so much smaller than their parents, however, they may have eaten different foods and lived in different environments from the adults, and that's the idea that has been illustrated here by one of the authors of this paper, Mark Whitten. And if you'd like to read more about this study, you can not only check out the original paper, which is open access, but also a blog post by the lead author, Darren Naish, summarizing their findings, which we will link in the description below.
Oh, sounds good. So, on to our next story. One of the great mysteries of paleontology are the Ediacaran biota, that strange assemblage of maybe or maybe not animals that creeped and rooted in the waters of the last few millions of years of the Precambrian. One of these organisms, the vaguely sea-pen shaped Charnia masoni, is the subject of this next paper. They, and other specimens like them, have been lumped into a taxon called Rangiomorpha, because they all seem to have shared a branching architecture to their growth. However, this aspect of their biology has been incompletely known because all paleontologists have had to go on were two-dimensional casts and molds of their fossils. Working with rarely preserved three-dimensional fossils of Charnia, the authors hope to dissect their branching body plans and see how their growth actually worked, while also trying to answer questions of phylogeny as well. Charnia's body is divided into multiple branching orders, including a lengthened leaf-like first order and a smaller centralized and interconnected second order. The authors revealed compartmentalized cavities inside these branches, but were unfortunately not able to decipher any meaningful information regarding what types of tissues and organs were present. In particular, they could not validate or deny a previously published hypothesis that Charnia's internal cavities were gastrovascular in nature. The 3D analysis also revealed that all the branches of Charnia's frond were indeed connected together, while the branches themselves seem to have grown as distinct structures through a hierarchical morphogenesis, in which subsequent first order branches grew out of second order branches in rapid sequence and within different phases, as is illustrated here on the left. By using the observed characters in the 3D fossils, the authors were able to plug them into a phylogeny with other living members of early diverging animal groups. Across the board, it was found that Charnia was a stem eumetazoan, belonging just outside the larger clade of animals with true tissues, neurons, and muscles, things like cnidarians, and bilaterally symmetrical forms, having evolved after the split with sponges and a little-known invertebrate group called placozoans, who have been argued to share affinities with some ediacarans on occasion. Now, the authors state that this is the first time an ediacaran has been able to be studied alongside other animals using a, quote, credible homology-based phylogenetic analysis, and this paves the way for future studies into the lives of these strange organisms.
Nice.
So, this next paper used isotopic analyses to bring new details on the life history and reproduction of titanosaurs, one of the last members of the sauropod lineage, and including some of its largest members. See the photo of me under the Patagotitan at the Field Museum to the right. Titanosaurs are not always known from complete remains, but we've at least found many nesting colonies, like those of the sites of La Rioja province in Argentina, where the remains used in the study were excavated from late Cretaceous rocks. After checking the isotopic measurements of the titanosaur eggshells, as well as a single tooth, alongside neighboring rock from the site, determining that the isotopes reflect life histories and not preservation bias, the authors could then interpret their findings. They were able to calculate the body temperature of a laying titanosaur based on the isotopes in the eggshell, and found that these dinosaurs had quite elevated body temperatures comparable to those of living birds, which has been argued heavily in the past. The analysis of the preserved titanosaur tooth, they also found a general growth occurring within an animal that maintained a constant body temperature, so we kind of have some corroboration going on. Isotopic studies on teeth are also good for understanding what types of food were being consumed, and traces were found of C3 plants, which is to be expected in a world that was not dominated by grasses and other C4 plants, at least not yet. And lastly, the authors were able to glean some idea about titanosaur nesting habits from the isotopic studies. Titanosaurs might have relied on hydrothermal activity in egg incubation, much like how some of the birds called megapodes of the western Pacific Islands bury their eggs in mounds of soil and warm their eggs through geothermal energy. Obviously, an animal as large as a titanosaur was not sitting on its nest. It also seems that titanosaurs preferred to lay their eggs during the dry season, since it would have been far more dangerous to nest during the wetter seasons where flooding could drown the eggs.
Right, that makes sense. Our next story is about these clusters of small animal bones from the late Cretaceous of Montana in the western United States. Several examples of these bone clusters were found, mostly consisting of bones from two types of mammals, Alphodon, which is a close relative of marsupials, and Phyllocomys, which is a member of an extinct group of mammals called the multituberculates. And one of these clusters also had part of a lizard skull inside it. based on evidence from the composition of the rocks that the bones were preserved in, the specific bones that were present in the clusters, and the damage to the bones themselves, which included etching that might have been caused by digestive acids. The authors of this study found it most likely that these represented pellets of indigestible material that had been regurgitated by a predator. If so, what kind of predator was it? Well, out of potential predators that had been found at this fossil site, the authors considered a Troodontid dinosaur to be the most likely candidate. They actually call the Troodontid from this locality Troodon, though that's controversial for reasons we don't need to go into here. But in any case, Troodontid fossils are indeed very abundant at this site, which includes remains of not just their bones, but also nesting sites. Their anatomy also suggests that they were well adapted to preying on small vertebrates, and direct evidence of pellet production has been previously reported for similar dinosaurs, such as Ichthyornis from the late Jurassic of China. Therefore, these findings could give us a lot of insight into troodontid biology, as well as the overall ecosystem that this fossil locality represents.
Wow.
Yeah. And last but not least, here is our final story. This is another one that we previously talked about on the 2021 update special for Dinosaurs, the second chapter, but it's very interesting, or I think so at least, so we'll cover it again here. Modern birds are basically divided into two major lineages. One is the ostrich-like birds, which also includes emus, kiwi, and their kin. So these are the paleonates, or the so-called old-jawed birds. And the other group is pretty much all other living birds, the neonates, or new-jawed birds. And we don't need to go into too much detail about the anatomical distinctions between these two. If you want to learn more, you can see episodes 2 and 3 of Dinosaurs, the second chapter. But the basic gist is that two of the bones in the palate of paleonate birds are fused together, whereas in neonate birds, these bones have a mobile joint between them. Traditionally, it has been assumed that the palate of paleonate birds was more similar to that of the last common ancestor that all birds evolved from, which is why they are called the old-jawed birds. However, a newly described skull of Ichthyornis from the late Cretaceous of Kansas in the Midwestern United States suggests that this may not be correct. Now, Ichthyornis was not a modern bird, but it was one of the closest relatives to modern birds that we know of in the fossil record, and may in some ways be a good model for what the last common ancestor of all living birds looked like. So this new specimen preserves part of the palate, and as it turns out, what there is suggests that it had a neonate-like palate, where there was a mobile joint formed by two separate bones, and so it may be the neonate palate that is a more ancient condition in the lineage leading to modern birds, which would be pretty ironic. Now, a minor thing about this paper that I'll quickly mention here because people have asked me about it. This study includes a phylogenetic analysis that incorporates a newly described fossil bird called Ichthyornis, which lived in what is now Belgium near the very end of the Cretaceous. It is one of the oldest convincing fossils of an actual modern-type bird. And I was part of the research team that described Ichthyornis in 2020, and in our study, we suggested that Ichthyornis was most likely closely related to the chickens and ducks and similar birds. But the analysis in this new paper finds Ichthyornis as an early paleonate. And, well, what is my opinion about this? The short answer is that I'm pretty skeptical. The support for this new result is not very strong, and the data set used here was focused more on teasing out the relationships among close relatives of modern birds instead of modern birds themselves. However, the new findings about Ichthyornis and what it can tell us about the evolution of the avian palate are extremely cool.
Absolutely.
And that's really it for our stories. You can find the next segment of Paleo Rewind 2021 on Dr. Polaris's channel, which will be linked in the description after it goes up. And if you enjoyed our video, please consider checking out the rest of our channel. We do monthly episodes on new discoveries in not just paleontology, but also other fields relating to natural history. We also have 2 long-form lecture series, both of which are now complete. One is called Humanity, a Prologue, which focuses on human origins, and the other is called Dinosaurs, the second chapter, which focuses on the evolution and diversity of modern birds. And we occasionally make other types of content as well. For example, our latest video is actually a review of an anime series that we really enjoyed. And for those who have been following along our last few episodes, here's a quick announcement about our upcoming interview of Miles Greb and Trey the Explainer. We are rescheduling this interview to sometime early next year, and you'll hear from us on our social media when we have a set date for that. We are also on Patreon, and if you are able and willing to support us in any way, we very much appreciate it. We currently have 2 patrons in total, one of whom is Joan's sister Julie, who is scheduled for a shout out in every episode. And we would additionally like to thank our friends Henry for our theme music and Alicia for the color scheme of my Alvarezor avatar. And furthermore, sincere thanks to Edge for inviting us to be a part of Paleo Rewind this year. If you'd like to keep up with our channel, you can follow us on Twitter or subscribe to us here on YouTube. We are very happy to take questions and feedback via email or the comments below, and see the video description for links to all the studies we talked about, as well as the other videos in Paleo Rewind. Take care, everybody.
See y'all later.